From a strategic perspective, when a lot of companies do podcasts, what they're thinking of first and foremost is, will this drive leads and sales? And there's pushback when you say it's relationship building and it's having conversations and it's creating content that's interesting. Not every episode has to be directly correlated to the pipeline. Some conversations will not impact demo requests at all. They'll just be good conversations that people will walk away and go, hey, I learned something from that podcast. And along the way, you'll build up better content, better relationships, more trust, and that will have an impact.
Welcome, business podcasters, to another episode of Podcasting in Professional Services. I am your host, John Tyreman, founder of Red Cedar Marketing. So if you're ready to start your podcasting journey, check us out at redcedarmarketing.com. Today, our guest is Mark Evans, founder of Marketing Spark and host of the Marketing Spark podcast. Mark helps B2B and SaaS CEOs figure out what matters, what to prioritize, and how to turn marketing into business outcomes during periods of change. Mark, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me on the show. Looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. We've been connected on LinkedIn for a while. And so folks that are listening to this, if you're not connected with Mark already, go ahead, give him a follow, join one of his 14,000 followers. That's crazy that you've had so much success on LinkedIn, Mark.
I think it comes from being early into the game. I think it goes back to during COVID when everybody was stuck at home and LinkedIn suddenly became the place where we spent a lot of time. And it was just when people started to create content on LinkedIn. People there's a lot of people who had already been doing it. But I just jumped on the bandwagon and gained a lot of momentum. And now everybody seems to be on the bandwagon, although we have some reservations about the new LinkedIn and how it operates.
Yeah, LinkedIn is, from my experience, has always been a bit clunky. It's always been kind of a little frustrating from a user's perspective, but the connections are real there that you can forge, and the people that are on the platform are generally pretty nice and pretty awesome human beings. And Mark, speaking of COVID, you were one of those podcasters who seized that opportunity during that time. You launched your show Marketing Spark in 2020, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So let's start there. I think that's a great jumping off point. What prompted you to start your podcast, Marketing Spark? Why start that in the first place?
It's an interesting story. So there's this marketing consultant, her name was Julie Zuzik, and she had a podcast, and I liked what she was doing. The problem was that it seemed to take a lot of time for her to put everything together, the recording, the editing, the distribution. And I was a little bit intimidated by the different platforms. Yeah. And so I shelved it, like a lot of people. Like, I had a busy consulting business and I just didn't think I had the time to do it, even though I wanted to. And then the platforms evolved. You got, Zencastr and Riverside and Anchor, and suddenly the barriers to entry disappeared. And you didn't need a lot of technical skills or sophisticated software to make it happen. And as an ex-journalist, as an ex-newspaper journalist, asking questions and interviewing people were something I really wanted to do. And suddenly the podcast doors were wide open, and it was like, why not? It's a great way to have conversations and meet all kinds of great people.
You looked at it as the barriers of entry lowered to the point where you felt like it was comfortable enough from a time investment perspective to take that leap. And did you find that to be true?
Absolutely. Yeah. Once I found the right tools, I think I started with Zencastr as my original recording tool. Once I found that, and then I used Audacity as the open source editor that I was using. Originally, I only did audio as opposed to video. Mm-hmm. And I just enjoyed the process. I enjoyed interviewing people. It was a great opportunity to reach out to really smart people and say, I have a podcast. Would you like to be on it? And it's still the case, but the vast majority of people who I invite, they say yes. I've only had a few people say no, and I'm always puzzled why they do that, because it doesn't take a lot of work to be a guest on a podcast. But it's been a really great way to talk to people and get like, I hate to say it, but get some free consulting along the way because you talk to people who are really
It's
smart in
true.
different areas.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I found that to be true too. Is sometimes like people you wouldn't expect to say yes end up saying yes, that they'll be a guest on your show. I know early on in my podcasting career, I shot a shot to Rand Fishkin, and lo and behold, he said yes and came on the show, which was really awesome. And you've had some pretty awesome names come on your show. I mean, Chris Walker, Robert Kaminsky, Dan Sanchez. I mean, these are like well-known people in the marketing world.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the reasons I think that they agreed to be on the podcast, one, they love doing podcasts and it's great for them. But two, we had connections on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
I'd commented on their posts. I'd reached out to them and established connections. And so when you made the ask, it wasn't like it was a cold ask. So it's interesting that you mentioned Chris Walker and Rand Fishkin because those are both big names. Chris is huge,
Yeah.
and Rand is, one of the highest profile personalities on LinkedIn. Everyone loves his videos. But because I had a relationship of sorts with them, when I made the ask, they agreed to say yes. And it's always great when high profile guests say yes. But at the same time, there's lots of really great people out there who are super smart, and they're also made for great podcasts as well.
Yeah, I like that you went there and talked about the like building of relationships and familiarity with people before kind of taking that next step. And like for example, you and I have had back and forths on LinkedIn over the years. And so that's why it was kind of like a natural step. I mean, you participated in the research report that we put out. Thank you, by the way, for doing that. That was awesome of you. So I think that's it goes beyond just the channel, right? And it's not even just like before like a podcast interview, but afterwards as well. Like when you're promoting the episodes after the fact, tagging those guests and keeping the light on them and showcasing their expertise. There's like this symbiotic relationship that happens with hosts and guests, and like a rising tide lifts all boats, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's like the whole dynamic of a podcast. It's a win-win proposition because we both have mandates and things that we want to achieve. As a podcast host, you're looking to drive brand awareness, create great organic content, build your presence. For me, I'm trying to obviously promote my consulting business. For the guest, if you do it properly, you put them in the spotlight, you promote the podcast in really effective ways to get their story out there. You give them all kinds of content that they can share on social media. And you end up A, having a great conversation, and B, forging a relationship. So going forward, you and I have a different dynamic to our relationship because we spent 30 minutes together. So you never know where that's going to lead. I always believe that conversations are where opportunities happen. And going back to our original thoughts about LinkedIn, the hierarchy in LinkedIn for me is conversations number one, connections number two, because those are the ones that lead to conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Then you've got content, and then you've got comments. And everyone thinks that content and comments are where it's at. But I believe that connections and conversations are the real gold. If you really want to leverage LinkedIn to drive your business forward, you focus on those and you can create some content along the way.
Totally. And your podcast is a part of that equation, and kind of like accelerating those conversations, taking those conversations off LinkedIn onto more of a synchronous setting. So I'm curious, Mark, what are some things that you learned along the way on your podcasting journey that maybe you didn't quite anticipate or expect when you first started?
I think the biggest lesson is that making a podcast, recording a podcast is relatively easy. And I say that relatively easy because, there's a lot of work involved in,
Yeah.
targeting guests and lining things up. The conversation, we're having a conversation. People like to talk and it's easy to ask questions and, people love to answer questions. The hard part, and I'm still struggling with this or still trying to work it, is distribution. Is once you do a podcast, then what? What do you do with it?
Yeah.
So you can do video clips, you can post on YouTube, you can promote in your newsletter and LinkedIn, but you've really got to have a systematic approach to driving it as much exposure as you can. Because in a sense, an episode, like, you want to squeeze as much juice out of that episode as possible,
Yeah.
because if you're doing once a week or bi-weekly, then it's an opportunity, but you gotta take advantage of it. So that continues to be a challenge. I think I do an okay job at it, but that's probably the biggest lesson I've learned when it comes to podcasting.
Yeah, I completely agree. And there's a balance that needs to be you need to strike the right balance between the frequency in which you publish episodes and then how much you promote each episode, because you're constrained by how much time and resources you have
Right.
to be able to do that. Now, what I found is that a monthly frequency is sometimes isn't enough to keep momentum going.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas a weekly frequency is a little bit like overkill and too much. I've got one client who does a weekly podcast, and he says it's like like a part-time job. And it is. I mean, he dedicates like all of Friday afternoon to recording every week.
Yeah, I think like in my experience, I've gone both ways. I've gone weekly and I've gone monthly, and I agree
Yeah,
with
me
you that
too.
bi-weekly feels good because you record
Yep.
it, you spend a week prepping, doing the editing and get everything aligned, and then you spend the next week promoting it. So that is a very healthy way to approach a podcast. The other thing that I've learned, just going back to your original question, is that sustaining a podcast is a lot harder than it seems. So whether it's a weekly or bi-weekly or monthly podcast, it's the idea that you have to do it consistently to be successful. It's like going to the gym. If you don't exercise regularly, you won't get any of the benefits. And it explains why a lot of people get excited about podcasts. They follow best practices and they record 5 podcasts before they launch. So they've got a nice library of podcasts, and then they do it for a month or two, and then they lose their interest and the podcast dies. And you know better than I in terms of the number of podcasts that are inactive. It's probably a lot.
Mhm.
So consistency and committing to doing it is one of the biggest lessons that I've learned along the way.
Yeah, totally. And the stats behind that are in the business genre of podcasts, only about 30% of the shows that are out there on Apple, on Spotify are active right now. In terms of distribution, you mentioned that as a challenge. So I guess like, how are you distributing your content today?
Yeah, that's a good question. So obviously you put it on YouTube, and I slice it into clips for YouTube and YouTube Shorts. So that's sort of the starting point. You publish the audio version via Riverside. So that's kind of the basics. And then what do I do with it? So one is to promote it in my newsletter. I have a weekly newsletter, so I can promote it there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, LinkedIn is an interesting beast because you have to sort of figure out what the angle is for every single post that you do, and then you need a
Yeah.
particular video to go along with the post. And the question is, how many posts can you squeeze out on LinkedIn? Is it one post for the podcast? Do you try to do two? Some If it's a good podcast and I have some there's really great answers, I'll try to do two. And my blog isn't that active these days, but if I was doing it, I would publish on my blog. But I think there's a lot more ways to do it. I just one is knowing what to do, B is having the time, and 3 is having systems in place to make it happen.
Yeah. The systems are so key. And, you know, I love Riverside for recording. Its editor is a bit limited, in my
Mm-hmm.
opinion. I know they're rolling out a new one in beta right now. I'm very excited to test that out, actually. Um, I found that, like, for the clips themselves, it is challenging to fit them into existing content calendars. Like if you're very active on LinkedIn, for example, and you've got an array of different topics you want to talk about, and not all of them line up with the podcast, that can be a challenge to fit them in.
Right.
In those scenarios, what I've found is that creating like a showcase page or a company
Mm-hmm.
LinkedIn page for the podcast can be
Right.
a good way to have that be a push channel, but then also inviting connections to follow the show on LinkedIn.
Huh.
And I found some success with some of my clients in doing that because they're not going to post on their own through their personal profiles, but we can push it out through a dedicated channel.
Ooh, I like that. I like that. That's what I'm going to do after we get off this podcast. I'm going to actually set that up. Actually, if we want to go back to tools for like Riverside, and I use Descript for video editing.
Me too.
And what I'd love to see is the love child of Riverside and Descript get together so that
Yes.
I didn't have to use both two platforms. I could only use one. I keep waiting for Riverside. They make these announcements. We have a beta editor, and I get all excited, and it's like, it's not so good.
So you've tried it out?
I have tried it out. Yeah,
Okay.
it just doesn't have. It's not as user friendly. Editing is a lot more difficult. But huge opportunity for Riverside. I mean, it's low hanging fruit, really.
I totally agree. And you mentioned Audacity in terms of like that like timeline editor, like the open source one. I remember using that on like Windows 2000 when I was trying to like do like GarageBand stuff. And the shift to a transcript based editor, it was just kind of like really like a stark shift. But that's what I love about Descript is you get the transcript editor, but you also get the timeline editor underneath where you can like
Yeah.
splice at specific points.
Yeah, it's a game changer. I don't know why I still use Audacity. I mean, I guess I could use Descript for certain things. I just so used to using it for audio that it's kind of old habits die hard. But there's so many tools out there.
Yeah.
You know what I'd really love to see, and Riverside does this is auto clipping, where they take your
Hmm.
podcast and they use AI to auto clip. It just doesn't work very well.
No, it doesn't. And I think it's because the AI lacks context on what you like, your audience, right? You know the like what their pain points are and what topics will resonate with them better than the AI. And so I think that's like the challenge there is like the AI doesn't know where to pick out the right moments, but you as a human and understanding that conversation and already having lived it, you know where those moments are. So you're in the best position to do that.
Or when you're listening to a podcast, and I do that when I edit, you're listening to the podcast, and all of a sudden you hear an answer, and you go, "That's it. That's
Yep.
not only a great clip, but that's a great piece of content for LinkedIn because the statement is so it's controversial or it's interesting or it goes against the grain, and AI just doesn't do that, at least not yet.
And then to take it a step further, one thing that I'm finding success with also is in Descript, you can pull in B-roll and like the GIFs and like other like stock photos and stuff. And it's important to do that within like the first 5 seconds to visually hook people. And so like I'll use the B-roll in the like the first few seconds to hook people in. And I've found that like those types of videos have had like a noticeable increase in
Hmm.
views on YouTube and on LinkedIn.
Interesting. Interesting. So
So
you're actually giving me lots of things to do, which I guess is a good thing.
where do you plan to take the show from here? Like what's on the horizon for Marketing Spark?
I guess my biggest goal is to get back to consistency. So, about a year ago, I took a full time job, and the downside of taking a full time job is that you have to work full time for somebody else, as opposed to being a consultant where you can set your own hours. So the podcast got a little sporadic. It's hard to have a lover and having an affair on the side when you're working full time. But I do want to get back to consistency and at least get back to bi-weekly podcasts. There's lots of opportunity there. I'd like to improve my distribution. Like for just more ways to become more efficient with the podcast to actually systematize editing and distribution. And that's about it. I mean, I don't have any big goals for the podcast. It's not like I want it to turn into some kind of bigger money making entity. If somebody wants to advertise in the podcast, that's great. But for me, it's a combination of professional development, developing relationships, extracting really great content, and ultimately to build brand awareness and to position myself as, hey, I want to talk to that guy, or I want to hire that guy because he seems to know what he's talking about. And that's kind of the overall strategy for the podcast.
That's awesome. And kudos to you for being able to at least keep it going. And it looks like you've been having it going at a monthly cadence over the last year or so.
Yeah,
So
monthly's been yeah, I've been trying. I was doing really well, like in terms of when I was more active on LinkedIn. Like the thing about LinkedIn when you're connecting with people and commenting on their posts is that you identify people who have a point of view. And so it's when that happens, it's the guest potential just goes pop, pop, pop. Oh, I got to talk to that person. I talk to that person. I talk to that. And I think last year I got away from LinkedIn, didn't spend as much time there. So I would say LinkedIn is probably my number one guest machine. Um, One thing we haven't talked about, and it is interesting, is like you, I get a lot of inbound from people pitching guests to be on my podcast. I guess there's some kind of machine out there that identifies
Yeah, I
marketing
get that too.
podcasts. And I would say 90%, if not more, of the podcast inbound is off target, irrelevant, wrong type of guests, people who don't even focus on B2B or SaaS. And I think about the people who are paying for those type of services, and you're it's a waste of it seems to be a waste of money. Maybe it works, I don't know, um that seems to, that's a struggle. If I'm we're getting really geeky and talking tools. I've actually got a Claude co-work skill that goes through all my emails, identifies the podcast inbound requests,
Oh, very cool.
ranks them, analyzes them, ranks them, and then auto generates a draft email based on how it assesses the podcast.
And you've been using that workflow?
Yeah, yeah.
That's awesome.
It needs a little tweaking because sometimes it gets a little AI-ish, in terms of the language. But for the most part, it does an amazing job of identifying who's good and who's not. And unfortunately, most of them are not very good. So it does a good job of identifying crappy podcast requests.
You bring up a really good point about like how much money those folks are wasting on like the wrong kind of outreach. And I most my business is mostly focused on producing content for podcasters. On occasion, I'll take on some work for trying to, land an expert as a guest on certain shows. And just because as a host, I've received the like irrelevant pitches, I like don't ever want to do that for my clients. So a little bit of research goes a long way. It doesn't take long. You can even use AI to help research, like what are the podcasts that fit this guest's area of expertise, target audience, all of that stuff.
I don't know what these services are. There's a lot of them obviously aren't doing a good job. In my last job, we wanted to drive brand awareness for our executive team. And so we hired an agency. I can't remember the agency, but we hired an agency to do it for us. And they actually did a really good job. We bought a package of, I think, 18 podcasts. I think we paid probably around $3,500 for them to arrange interviews. So it was about $200 a pop. I'd say, half to two-thirds were podcasts that were on point and had the big enough audience and were good conversations. And the other ones were okay, but the real value there was that we took all the raw material and we leveraged it to write LinkedIn posts and do YouTube videos. So in that sense, it generated a lot of it. And they did a great job. So I think there's value in hiring the right agency to do it for you if you've got budget. And then if you can leverage the raw content to drive marketing, if you can, drive distribution from that, then you get ROI on that.
And so I'm just really curious about that. Was that teed up to those podcasters ahead of time? Like, hey, we want access to the media afterwards?
Yes, absolutely. That was
That
part of the deal, that the agency made it clear that we wanted access to the video, and most podcasters are very happy to do it because for them it just means the word is spreading wider for their podcast. And so they don't have a problem with that. And it's so easy to share content these days. And they didn't do any of the work. They didn't do any of the editing. They just shared the video.
exactly.
Or I would just download the video off YouTube that they had published, and then I started to chop it up myself using Descript, which is really easy. But never had a problem, and got great. It was like $200 an episode was great value for what we were doing.
Yeah, totally. Especially for how far you stretched it with the YouTube videos and the LinkedIn posts. So yeah, with a mind towards distribution. See, that's the thing that like podcasts are like one of the greatest forms of content for distribution potential, because you've got the audio content, you've got video content, you've got text-based content that you can use. And I think like it's still sourced from like a human point of view and it's fueled by personality, which I think is incredibly important, especially today when there is so much AI slop
Yeah.
out there on
Yeah.
LinkedIn. So podcasts are a great way to kind of cut through that. You mentioned that like you want to keep the podcast going. It's a source of personal development for you. Even though that you took on a full-time job, you've got the consulting gig, you still want to do the podcast.
Well, when the full time job is no longer a full time job, I've gone back to consulting, so I've got a little more time on my hands, or a lot more time on my hands. Um, I don't know. I mean, if going back to my days as a journalist, I mean, the reason I became a journalist is I like meeting people, interviewing, asking questions. I'm very curious about the world around me, always looking to learn. And so, just as a personal development tool, that in and of itself keeps me going because there's just so many smart people out there. And a podcast, as I said, is just an easy way to convince people to have a conversation with you. Like it's going to a party and you go up to someone and say, "Hey, can I talk to you?" And they say yes right away, as opposed to they don't know who you are. So that's one. And I mean, I think the other side of it is that you're right. With so much AI generated content out there, there's a lack of authenticity. Um, there's a lack of real insight because the robots are creating everything these days. So when you're having a conversation, it matters. And my personal view is that the AI pendulum is going to start to swing back. Everyone's got super
Agreed.
excited about AI and how it can automate processes and basically allow you to cut and paste content. But I think it's coming back because I think a lot of people are disillusioned with AI generated content right now. You can recognize it like easily on blogs and LinkedIn. And
And once
so
you see it, it just totally turns you off.
yeah, and you're just like the words that people use, the expressions, the different approaches, and I think when you see real content, then that's going to make a difference, and I think it'll basically be a brand asset going forward. And it's funny because I saw a LinkedIn post about this guy saying, my best posts are things that I just riff off on a Saturday morning. I don't, he just, and that's what I find as well. But those are authentic; those are real, right?
Yeah.
And I think podcasts are real conversations with real people, and people like that. And I think that's probably one of the most powerful things about podcasts these days.
Dead internet theory, right? If you don't know what you can trust on the internet, then there's nothing to trust on the internet. And that's why trust, I think, has been so important over the last few years, especially, and it's tied to AI. Because how do you know that CEO's not writing that LinkedIn post? How do you know he's not using a ghostwriter or using AI, right? You don't. But a podcast, like this is clearly like we are having a conversation right now. We are two human beings, even though, we're in different locations. You're in
Right.
Toronto and I'm in Virginia, but we're still like having a conversation, connecting as humans.
I think if we look at the value of podcasts, I would hazard a guess that easily 50% of content on LinkedIn is generated by AI right now.
I think it's
Easy.
54%. I
Is
just
it?
looked that up the other day. Yeah.
And so when you get to that point, then skepticism about that content starts to grow and grow and grow. And then LinkedIn,
Mhm.
for a variety of other reasons, starts to lose its relevance, starts to lose its appeal as a place. I don't know if we'll see an explosion in podcasts as a result of AI slop, but certainly the people who love podcasts, love making them, I think will lean into them harder.
Yeah, I think we're going to see a resurgence in in-person events. I think the podcasts are certainly going to be a product of that. Videos on YouTube, I think YouTube is poised really, really well as a marketing engine in B2B and software circles. Well, Mark, what didn't we talk about today that you think our listeners, business podcasters, should know?
Okay, here's one thing that we hadn't talked about when it comes to,
Sure.
to business podcasts is that from a strategic perspective, when a lot of companies do podcasts, what they're thinking of first and foremost is, will this drive leads and sales? Will this allow us to better connect with prospects? Is it a Trojan horse that we can use for getting people into the funnel?
Yeah.
So it's always very business oriented. And there's pushback when you say it's relationship building, and it's having conversations, and it's creating content that's interesting. And so not every episode has to be directly correlated to the pipeline. Some conversations will not impact demo requests at all. They'll just be good conversations that people will walk away and go, hey, I learned something from that podcast. There's no, direct financial ROI when you do a podcast. And I think a lot of companies make a mistake because they get stuck in that perspective, and they forget the fact that what we're doing in a sense is we're entertaining, we're educating, and we're not trying to sell it all. And that's okay, right? And along the way, you'll build up better content, better relationships, more trust, and that will have an impact. So you just have to look at a podcast in the sense that it delivers value in different ways. Some of them are tangible. We can say, okay, that I did that podcast and that happened. And some are hard to quantify, but it doesn't mean that a company shouldn't do podcasts. It just means that you just have to look at it and see that there are different ways to get value from a podcast.
I like the way that you phrased that. A podcast delivers value in different ways. Mm-hmm. And it's so true. And that value is different. In my experience, the value is different for all of my clients. Like some want the podcast as more of a visibility engine. Some want to use the podcast as more of a relationship builder. Some want to use the podcast as just a platform for them to bloviate and speak their minds.
Yeah, for sure.
One of my clients has said he was tired of flying around the country and doing speaking engagements at like local associations. And so that's why he wanted to start a podcast, is so that he could speak his point of view from his comfy office. I think that's a fantastic point to end our conversation, Mark. So for listeners who are listening, or for viewers right now, if they want to connect with you, obviously LinkedIn is the place. Subscribe to the Marketing Spark podcast. Is there any other places that you're active that they should go and check out?
No, that's about it. I mean, obviously my website, marketingspark.co. And in terms of the guests that I like on my podcast, it's B2B and SaaS CEOs and founders. I really like talking to in-house marketing leaders, people who are in the trenches, doing marketing. And then there's guests who go against the grain. They talk about topics that aren't getting a lot of attention these days. Like, for example, I'm talking to someone later this week who does advertising fraud, digital advertising fraud, and all the money that's being wasted on advertising. That's something I never focus on, but it's a really cool conversation. So those are the kind of things. You're just looking for interesting people and interesting to talk about.
Totally. Well, if that sounds like you, if you are an in-house marketer or someone who's going against the grain, hit up Mark and see if you can be a guest on the Marketing Spark podcast. Well, Mark, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me. Always like doing this. Always like to be on the other side of the studio for a change after hosting so many. But thanks for inviting me to be on your podcast.